name is Nitin Gaur. I have 400 slides and I have 45 minutes. So I'm going to speak really, really fast.
Let's go.
And I had some coffee too, and I'm Indian, so that's just too much speed. But there's a story behind why I speak so fast. I moved from India to US in about 92, 93 timeframe. The calling rate was $1 a minute, and I had to call home once a week. So I had to really speak fast and have the right words per minute so I could communicate my message to my parents. Of course, times have changed, and now you realize that it's almost free to talk to anybody, anywhere in the world. My point behind that story is that technology changes lives. It changes the way we operate, the way we do things. And all the speakers that were in the morning who spoke about a lot of disruptive element, Virex, Dash, and Settle, I'm going to provide a different perspective of the industry landscape with blockchain. I've been doing this since 2011. So it's been a long journey for me, and I still look much younger. With blockchain, I have more gray hair because it's just so much going on in the industry. So what I'm here to do is provide you a perspective of the divide. So the session here is addressing the trust divide. There are two sides of the equation. One side is the crypto space, which is super interesting, super dynamic, really, really cryptic, no pun intended at this time. And then you have the enterprise space, which is our traditional banks, financial institutions, supply chain companies, shipping companies, trying to understand and take advantage of technology. I'm here to provide the two perspectives that we see it from the enterprise space and what we have encountered from the disruptive element, which is challenging the very industries that we plan to operate. But one, I'm glad to be here. And the reason why I'm glad to be here is for these reasons. Love the football, love the finals. So round of applause to Team Croatia here, because, and what a comeback in tennis. You lost the football game, but you beat it back yesterday. So that's another round of applause. So that's great. So I think a small country with amazing feat in sports, innovation, technology. Tesla was from here. So there must be something about this region that makes you also interesting and so much achievement with such a small country. And I think I know the reason. It's the fourth point. You're the fourth world's alcohol consumption in the world per capita. To me, that's pretty impressive too. And the last thing, which I got to experience for the first time, because my first time in this country, is Strictly. I thought that's another reason why you're so innovative. So that aside, what are we trying to do with blockchain? We are trying to solve two fundamental issues. So regardless of all the things that you've heard, all the things that you've seen with blockchain doing this or that, we're foundationally solving two things: time and trust. And if there's anything you should take away from this 45 minutes, is this slide, because this acts to me as a litmus test of the use cases, the problems we are solving is for these two things. Time is one construct that has a lot of implication in many industries. The time it takes to move money across borders, the time it takes to have visibility of containers through shipping lines, the time you have to see when you transfer money or you buy stocks or you buy your financial products, the time it takes for you to realize the value and to be able to move the value is where you have a lot of trust intermediaries, a lot of cost, a lot of opacity of information. So all of us in this room or around the globe are spending anywhere between 2 to 4% because of opacity of that information. And trust is essentially entities who are making business because of the time lag, because of information opacity. So you have a lot of trust intermediaries, some of them being your banks. Some of them are entities that you don't deal with directly with, are the entities who are leveraging this notion of the lag of time lag and providing a service, whether it's service of liquidity, service of transparency, service of providing stand-in services on your behalf or your bank's behalf. So time and trust has amazing, has enormous elements in many industries, and blockchain is trying to solve these two issues. Regardless of the use case, regardless of cryptocurrencies, regardless of any of the use cases that have been discussed today or will be discussed tomorrow, these two are the elements that we're trying to solve for. The question then becomes, how big is the problem, and why are we doing it? So I want to present some numbers. These are interesting numbers I researched for this particular element. Of course, 17% of banks will release blockchain by 2017, 2018, and we know why. I think you've seen JPMC talk about IIN networks. We see a lot of projects, again, trying to get one up ahead of the disruption that you see from the Silicon Valley or from the crypto valley. Another interesting part is that 10% of global assets of GDP will be on blockchain. That brings an interesting point. And we always draw the analogy of the fact that what information, what internet has done for information, we expect blockchain to do things of value, and GDP is a measure of that value that's created. And it's interesting that we begin to talk about the storage of these values or asset that's locked in the system in future. Of course, 2.3 billion as a technology company, it's interesting for me as an IBMer because we have now some numbers that we can capitalize on. But there's something this is really interesting in this, which is why I'm doing it, besides, of course, a paycheck. And that's the $176 billion number. That's essentially the value that doesn't exist today. This is the future of Amazon, eBay, Google's, Tencent of the world, which doesn't exist today, which are the business models that, of course, what internet did, it took us a decade, it took us 10 years before we began to buy tickets, do commerce, do banking. But for 10 years, there was an evolution of technology protocols, and that's the journey we are in through, in my opinion. But for us to truly exploit blockchain in its truest form is those new business models, the new value models, the disintermediation of some of the entities that exist today. I think that is the most exciting part. So if you're here, I want to think in these terms that what happens if I could tokenize an asset, a tangible or intangible asset, create a network, and systemically move the asset from point A to point B without having to have the intermediaries, and what is the business model I can derive from it? And I'll give you some tangible examples that I have seen in the past 5 years from the infancy of some silly Excel spreadsheet project move to blockchain to some serious projects that we begin to see, especially in terms of custody assets and so on and so forth. So think in those terms is, what is the enablement of those new business model? What is what we call as instance economy, the ability for you all to be able to invest globally, to be able to consume digital products of value across the globe, for you to be able to buy and invest into US stock markets or European stock markets or Chinese stock market without actually having to go through access of the institutional banks that are involved in doing so. I think that's where we're heading with this piece. So what is blockchain in general from a technology perspective? And we see all these terms. We talk about a trusted digital transaction system, a platform for disintermediation. And I've written a paper on this topic, so happy to invite you to connect with me. I write quite a bit in terms of what I see, what I observe. But the most interesting thing for me is the third option, which are the co-creation models. Because we do have a digital marketplace. We have many digital marketplaces in the world. But co-creation element is what we are after. It is ability for us to be able to derive new synergies between market participants. So imagine you have a network, and you're trying to move assets. What else can I do? And I'll give you a live example of what I'm working on and my team globally is working on in terms of creating that co-creation element of synergies that didn't exist today because they were disconnected ecosystems that we have because of information networks. Second thing is, if you think about it, internet or information networks were never really designed to move value. We're using it to move value. You're able to bank. You're able to transfer money. But the internet was designed to move information per se. So we are working at the protocol layer to be able to really define what does an asset mean. And that is leading to a lot of interesting challenges, interesting memes. Now, these platform definition as we see it has interesting confusion. And imagine my job talking to financial customers, talking to clients who may not fully understand the value of it. You start having interesting conversation that suddenly now irrelevant conversations around, look, blockchain is consuming so much energy. Why should I use for my business? Because it's going to cost me so much more to do it. Or a few years later, we had every single use case was a blockchain use case, which was ridiculous and crazy. Everybody wanted blockchain. And from human resources to a simple use case that you can do on spreadsheet or databases, people wanted blockchain for it. So it was this euphoric moment leading to somebody thinking back and saying, let's not talk Bitcoin, let's talk blockchain, which is also interesting because Bitcoin is the genesis of it, so you just cannot completely divorce it from it. To the point where after 4 years, we were getting angry at people who were simply using blockchain to say, stop it already, let's find the right use cases. So having said that, there's a short video I want to talk about. It's about 2 minutes, which is a perfect example of my world, my conversation with my clients, who will use the right words to be able to get the attention, but they'll mumble a few things.
Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer digital currency. It's anonymous and decentralized. It's like being able to teleport money to anyone across the world. No, I think it's actually being teleported. So we have many peers that each and every Bitcoin on a public blockchain. And you want to send someone a Bitcoin, you publicly announce that your account is sending a Bitcoin to their surveillance account. Since the letters are public record, everyone knows Bitcoins are associated with each account. It prevents anyone from spending money that isn't there. And hold it, you have banks all over for you, and then you go lock up. Make sure bandits didn't ride off with it. With Bitcoin, the only existence is protected on the blockchain. There's nothing to keep banks or government. All that matters is your private key. Your encryption definitely comes there, that you access your account and send money from.
Vince Clortho, Keymaster of Gozer.
As long as you're in privacy, no one can see other Bitcoins, and you're sent from memory. That's why Bitcoin is protected in his pledge. How was that?
You get the point. So you focus on all the important things: Bitcoin, blockchain, distributed hash, hash technology. We can have the provenance. And you get to a point where you diminish the real value of what some of us are trying to build over time, right? So I've been at this for 5 years. I have a global team. And few things that I want to share here is that these are the use cases my team is currently working on globally. These are the use cases we've defined business value. These are the use cases that industry has defined the real cost element of it. So there's one thing of the romance of technology, but the other thing is to be able to apply technology in a meaningful way to create the right use cases. So this is the collection of use cases that, from an industry perspective, said, by the way, I had 1,200 use cases, and over time, we are down to 13 in production. That's my failure rate. So I don't want to do POCs anymore. Wall Street last year did about 380 plus POCs. Not a single one of them is in production because we haven't solved the business challenges. While the technology has the promise, I think what you have to understand is be able to find the business case, business value. So there's a methodology that we have developed. I published a book a few weeks back. I'm publishing another book for managers and executives to understand the financial models, the risk models of understanding, blockchain tech. Second thing is, these are the referenceable use cases, and some of them are really cool. I spent a year on Northern Trust. It's a private equity marketplace use cases that we built for a client. This is private equity. For those of you know, it's a very illiquid market. It's very paper-based. So the first step of most projects are digitization, and then eventually moving that digitization to tokenization, and then eventually creating a marketplace. That's the journey that you find in more of these paper-based technologies. Another interesting thing is this Smart Dubai. You should look into it if you haven't already. I'm actually heading from here to Dubai and Saudi. But Dubai has embraced blockchain to the point they want to create identity, passports, ability to be able to have government functions. So if you were to move to Dubai, you realize that to be able to rent a house, it takes a lot of government processes. And the ability for me to provide verification, validation, digitization of these things is where we're heading with this. So these are some of the meaningful use cases we've applied. And we've seen some real tangible benefits from some of these. Some of them are still government projects, which takes longer for the ROIs to come through. But something to remember that it's not just a fad. There's this disruptive world of creating value, and this one world is using blockchain for transformation in many of these industries. This is what I was talking about, the $176 billion number, is the new markets, new synergies, new co-creation elements. What you see on the left-hand side is what IBM and Maersk are building is global trade logistics. This is a network that's trying to tokenize your containers, which is these massive containers that move globally. And that way we can try to streamline the logistics-based processes. And what you see on the right hand is the financial services. Of course, economy is all about movement of goods and movement of money. It's a value system. So in most cases, when the goods move on the shipping containers, they are financed. Somebody takes the risk, and somebody has a business model behind that risk. So we're building a network with VTrade in Europe, which is right here, where we have 9 European banks, and we are focusing only on SME, the small and mid-enterprise, focusing on trade finance, which is the financial flow behind the trade. So imagine I have 2 networks. One is addressing the banking system. One is addressing the logistics system. For me to be able to co-create, if I can derive the information from both these networks, I can then start creating risk models. I can create new products. I can focus on for example, cattle farms, warehouses, if I can reposition or repurpose my warehouses based on the trade flows and goods, those businesses don't exist today because most of these are very static models. And this is what I mean, that you'll begin to see disintermediation of many entities who are involved because they're middlemen, but you see a rise of a new set of intermediaries who are able to exploit this business value. So if there's something else you should take away from this 45-minute presentation or so is, what is that co-creation? How will this change your business or the new business models that don't exist today, which will give you a leg up? And there's something similar to what we had seen in the internet era as well, that we don't have travel agents, but we do have Expedia, we do have Trivago, which manage the holistic travel experience that I have today. So enterprise blockchain is this, which is dealing less with crypto tokens, but there is still cryptography, there is still technology that we use in many of the crypto spaces meaningfully to induce trust, to induce transparency, to tokenize assets. So while it may not be a Bitcoin, it may be a token that we are tracking and tracing and enduring the same levels of trade, trust, ownership type elements around it. And all this was cool, but then you also have this beautiful, interesting, amazing world around crypto building up. And there are 4,000 blockchain companies in New York City alone. There are 40,000+ in the world. Each of them going after every single business I talked about so far, including our own. So you have this middleware and dev tech, which is the space we operate in, is building layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 protocols. And eventually you begin to see a lot of entities trying to exploit these protocol layers to build their business on top of it. So this is a dichotomy. The dichotomy where the straitjacket industries are trying to leverage technology to be able to transform, and you have the disruptors who are trying to say, I'm going to fight this, I'm going to make this better. And that is a healthy balance per se. But that also creates challenges. It creates challenges of understanding. So if I were to ask everybody in the room, how many of you know what Bitcoin is? How many of you know what Bitcoin is? Really know what Bitcoin is? Okay, so if I were to ask you the entire process of how it's generated, the entire mining algorithms, there's a whole lot of elements to understand. I think the gentleman for Wirex gave an amazing presentation on what we are trying to do as an industry to solve the technical issue of scaling and is still ensuring that we have the trust in the system. You begin to understand there's a serious lack of understanding in the industry, including the entities who are building on top of these protocols because they have a product, as opposed to understanding the lower level protocols. It also creates a challenge in the government, and I work with a lot of central banks and financial institutions where governments don't understand, and that lack of understanding leads to interesting challenges from the government itself, whether it comes to regulatory environment, whether it comes to other entities around it. Not to mention the volatility, the lack of market infrastructure, the boundary of how and when do we trade. There's no trading window for many of these entities, which I find the left-hand meme pretty interesting because that's how markets fluctuate. By the time I ask for $1, the entire conversation itself has gone, the price taken on left and right, only because of the fact that in the nascency of the industry and lack of understanding, lack of foundational elements of what drives the value of these digital tokens is missing from the picture. Not to mention that you have a new community of, whether it's a cocktail party conversations or understanding as to what really gives this token value. And to me, it's the valuation of trust. Is giving you the notion of what drives trust and how much are you willing to pay for it, as opposed to, let's say, if I tokenized gold or diamond, that's collateralized backed. That's the stablecoin conversation the wire extent teams begin to talk about. Having said that, I have two sides. I have two worlds that I, as a professional, blockchain professional, have to go to clients and bridge the gap between the two. One is every industry having a use case, trying to solve the blockchain problems. And then you have these layers of development, whether it's side chains, Tether, stable coins, having the notion of lightning networks, plasma, a whole sort of, a box of these technology solutions are trying to solve the issue of scalability, trust, transparency, and openness that the blockchain has the promise of. So this is the challenge. This is why I have so many gray hair, because we have to explain layers of technology, but at the same time, keeping an eye on two things. What are the two things? Time and trust are the two fundamental issues. So the use cases that don't have these two problems, I think we have to revisit and say, do we have enough technology today to foundationally address the use cases and the challenges around it? Now we dig in to talk about two things. One is, Most use cases that you have seen, read, understood, or been a part of, it's either about reconciliation or it's about, look, an asset is here, it moved from here to here. What we have not addressed in many use cases is the notion of settlement. At the end of the day, we are building value networks. So when you transfer things of value, your car, your house, your instance of a house, you still have to get money in return. So there are a lot of concepts that we've been toiling around, and there are crypto assets as opposed to cryptocurrencies, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. And then you have the normal world that the central banks talk about, which is basically virtual currencies, digital currencies, and then there's something in between. And I believe that if we don't solve the issue of digital fiat, fiat is the kuna and the dollar you have in your wallet, if you don't digitize it, then you're fundamentally solving one part of the equation. And that's the conversation I've had with Robert from Dash, is today we're using it as a mode of exchange. We're using this crypto asset as a mode of exchange, as opposed to something that has the ability to hold value, preserve value, and transfer value. It's a really, really important concept that all the startup companies, all the entities who are looking at this are solving one part of the equation. 99% of financial service use cases are focused on reconciliation. Reconciliation is nothing but, matching the two databases and figuring out the discrepancies around it. If we are using blockchain for doing reconciliation, then we're not doing enough, because that's not the promise of what we're trying to solve. So understand that the new currencies, new taxonomies, today may seem chaotic, but I think we're heading in the right direction. I think what's happened in the past few weeks, that was also discussed by Wirex guy here, was around the fact that it's winter for cryptocurrency, but it's not a bad thing. It institutes more understanding. It eliminates a lot of noise, so we can focus on signals. So what I decided this year is, instead of the noise, the 1,200 use cases and the fun and games we've had so far, focus on basics. Fundamental tenets of blockchain: trade, trust, ownership, are three elements of what we want to figure out as to what the assets are. You have to address duality of a transaction. If I'm exchanging something with you, it's an exchange. I have to get something in return for the exchange to be equitable. It has to be about digital assets. What is a digital asset, and how does it get its value? Of course, if it's gold and diamond, if it's collateralized, then I need to understand that piece. But if it's simply a coin, an XYZ coin or Nitin coin, besides my reputation, what is the valuation of the coin? I think that's what you have to understand around it. Second thing is, you cannot solve all of this issue till we solve the issue of digital identity, because it's a digital asset. If I'm moving the digital asset in a network, I cannot assign a digital asset to your passport or to driver's license. I have to have a digital personification of you, me, companies, enterprises, the EIN type entities that we have to have on. So the notion of a legal entity, what does that mean in a blockchain network, has to be addressed. But again, if all we're doing is replicating databases and reconciling them, which is what most POCs do, I think we are failing on what blockchain is meant to promise to address. So my focus for 2018 with respect to blockchain is as follows. So I wrote a paper on this topic as to why I've chosen these 6 things, that if we don't address this 6th thing, and this is not true just for enterprise blockchain, which is our playground, it's also true for many of the projects who are leveraging the public blockchain networks, is around digital identity for obvious reasons. Digital fiat, you have to have the notion of digital fiat in the system. You have to have asset tokenization. What I mean by that, in cases where you don't have systemic currency, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, they have a systemic token that's generated, there's an economic model behind it. But what if there are many hyperledger-based systems that we have built for clients which doesn't have necessarily a tokenization or incentive economic system? How do you tokenize a container or your diamond or your gold and ensure that token is singular in nature, it's one of a kind, it's maintained as asset integrity? And what happens when you have 2 networks, and this, by the way, is an industry problem, you move a token from one network to another network, how do you preserve the integrity of that token? Because right now, no matter how many tokens you hear, unless everything is built on, it's only centric to a network, which means an Ethereum token cannot operate in Bitcoin network. You need something in between to provide the fungibility in exchange. So asset tokenization encompasses those challenges that lets me move my thing of value between multiple networks, between multiple multiple countries. Second thing is security design. I think this, to me, I've spent the last 4 years of my life in figuring out as to how do we because we are trying to build value networks. So your issues around cybersecurity risk is exponential, only because now I'm not only taking your information and monetizing it, I'm taking your assets. So security design and security infrastructure for public and private networks, as we call it, is really, really vital. I've written a paper on the topic. Connect with me, and happy to share some of the foundational elements around this. Second thing is business models. I'll tell you this, that 90% of my projects have failed, not because of technology, but because they didn't have business model. If we didn't figure out as to how do you make money from it, what are the elements, and I've also written like what are the sort of models that are coming and what are the risks for those models. You can't simply, for example, a company cannot, and I'll give you an example of Walmart. Walmart cannot come and start a network because blockchain is not a software technology, it's a network, it's an ecosystem. So you need all the different players join the network, and why will entities who compete with Walmart join the Walmart network, for example? And the last thing is governance model. Also very interesting topic, written extensively about it, where many of the Bitcoin blockchain network have a governance system of its own by mining, but many of the network that we're building for enterprises, you need to institute the governance structure in those elements. So I'll take a pause here, and with a show of hands, are you with me so far? Does it make sense? Okay, good. I wrote something on this topic where this is a summary of my 4 years of experience. I've learned this. These are 7 things that you have to have a design principles. You could have more. I put 7 because it's a good number. It gives you a digestible element. It gives you more hit on LinkedIn. But I had 7 because it makes it simple and easy for our clients to understand are some of the design imperatives that we expect our clients as you're designing a blockchain system, whether you're designing a public network with token in it, or you're designing a system on top of any of the existing blockchain networks. A few things you have to maintain in this piece is we live in a world, and the world works just about okay. It could be better. There's a banking system in the world. We can buy things. We can exchange things. So there are systems in place, and so whatever system we're implementing, you have to integrate with existing systems, which is the most expensive part of blockchain networks. System integration with existing system is interesting. Second thing is, we want to provide, if we are creating an open network and we want multiple participants to join, just like you would join in any of the networks to trade cryptocurrencies, then you have to make sure that each participant has control on their businesses. And then you have technical and you have non-technical requirements of these design solutions. Again, this is all online. Have a look at it. It takes nuggets of all the lessons we've learned from failed and successful projects of what really makes sense. This is my penultimate slide where we had to write in terms of what's the path. So, of course, if you're a startup company, you can come up with interesting things, and eventually, until it shows value, you're constantly struggling to define and collect money from it. But to me, the first step, use case identification, is the most difficult part of the journey. Because you got to pick a use case, and I joke with my clients that if you go to a bank, they'll have 100 use cases, because of course, every use case has a blockchain implication for it. But I tell my clients that you got to put a ring on it. You got to make a commitment and say, this is the use case we're going after. And the use case need to have 2 things. It has to be big enough. It has to have enough industry challenges that the money and time and talent to be spent, there's a return on investment. Second thing is, if you're solving this problem for yourself, it should also be your industry cohort's problem, because that leads to a network effect. And we use this lens to make sure that you don't have some lousy use cases, because I have clients who want me to solve a problem, and that problem costs them $2 million a year. And if you give me enough hardware, enough software, enough redesign, I can solve those problems of time, especially batch processing, for example, in many banks. So if we are truly implementing the right solutions around this, we need to make sure it has enough industry gravitas to be able to solve those issues around it. So, and then from there, we define the business blueprint, what will look like in future, who are the participants, what is their interest. Then we design the technology blueprint, which is where we implement all the security elements of it, the interaction between the two, how do you keep the network organic, and then we lead to creating what we call a minimum viable ecosystem, which is how many participants do we need to kick off a network, which is the challenge of most startup companies too, because I like one of the judges, like you have AI and blockchain in most projects, but the biggest challenge of blockchain is ecosystem, essentially getting the right players to come to the table and transact. And the biggest challenge of AI on top is data. Can't have intelligence without data. So that ecosystem building is a really, really difficult and important part of blockchain networks, which is what entities like Dash and many of the crypto asset-based networks are trying to build an ecosystem, because without the ecosystem, there are no transaction, and without no transaction, there's no inherent value in the network that you're creating. Those are the just foundational elements of blockchain. So with that, I have about 9 minutes, and I know I compressed a lot of information in this past 40 minutes or so, but I do want to give you a chance to see if you have any questions. Again, I'm spending most of my time now on 2 or 3 things, which is digital fiat, which is working with central banks, which is a 10-year project, is creating digital fiat. But the biggest challenge is the human interaction and ability for us to remove. And that's why I think I liked your thing, Robert, is to not make blockchain too complicated or too cryptic, and keep it simple and straightforward, and design systems behind it that prevents from wrong things happening, and have systems in place that undoes the wrong things. So with that, any questions first? Second thing, did it make sense? Because you spent 40 minutes with me, and that time you're not getting back. So I'm hoping this is worth your time to spend the time with me, and I do appreciate your patience, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you for that one question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure.
Blockchain industry.
That's a,
Thank you.
yeah, so
Should I repeat the question?
I think you should. Otherwise, I'll do it. I'll butcher it.
Yeah, so we are coming from different worlds. Considering this slide, I love it, by the way. In my open source world, it's a little bit different than in enterprise. What is the direction of enterprises?
Yeah, that's a
in blockchain.
That's a $1 million question, and I think I should have mentioned this in a few slides back when I was showing this piece here, right? That I see a convergence. What I mean by that is, we start the journey with Hyperledger, which is meant for permission private, which is basically just a known participant creating a network, as opposed to what they're building, which is open source, open community driven, like anybody can join the network and have a more democratic way of interacting and transacting. What I see now is a convergence between those two worlds. I start seeing, which is what we've seen with Stellar and Ripple and many of the public protocols, is creating a public-private mechanism. So the innovation coming from open source is brilliant. It's truly brilliant in terms of the rate at which we are moving in terms of security, in terms of protocols, in terms of elements like zero-knowledge proofs, the elements of what we're trying to create new transaction systems, Plasma, Lightning networks, trying to address the scale and security of it. And from the enterprise perspective, I've stolen many of those concepts in the past to say, this innovation is happening, we should just piggyback on this innovation. I see a convergence where, for 2 reasons. One reason is your open source community is developing software and things that are needed for blockchain evolution at a much faster rate than IBM and Oracles of the world. That's one. Second thing, I think what we're doing is we have access to the enterprise systems in a regulated way. So we want to design systems that's compliance and conforming to the regulated entities. So we have 2 choices. One choice is we build a private network, but that doesn't solve all the problems, because private network is still closed network. So what we begin to do is, can we now build the same network we design in the public-private realm, taking advantage of innovation and technology that you're building, essentially, and build an ecosystem on that. It's symbiotic, because the more business we get on those networks, it promotes transactions, which is the end goal of most blockchain networks. So we see that. Second thing is, example, we've had a lot of conversation on stablecoin this morning from the Wirex gentleman. Stablecoin is a perfect example of the middle ground, which means we are coming to terms that we can digitize fiat. Central bank will not do it yet, ECB, Bank of England, because they have to study, and there's an economic impact, there's a monetary policy impact, and so on and so forth. So because they cannot go today to issuing digital sort of fiat, we're using stablecoin as a collateralized token. It's still conformant, it's still regulatory. right? Whereas we have about 11 projects in the world, not only on IBM, but many other technologies, which is focusing on real-time gross settlement, which is interbank payment system between the banks on blockchain that removes the reconciliation issues and so on and so forth. So I think we begin, and then STOs or security tokens and tokenized securities. So this asset tokenization to me is a middle ground in saying, let the regulation be, it's important, and it's necessary to protect entities, and how can we now begin to tokenize securities or whatever the case is and still be compliant with systems. That convergence has begun to happen. It's a matter of time till it becomes more ubiquitous and regulation keeps up with technology. But we have to, and I'm saying this as an IBMer, as an individual, no matter what we want to challenge the regulation, I think from our financial services and value network industries, we have to adhere to those regulatory requirements because it has implications. I have done 120 experiments on Bitcoin network where I've lost my public key and I can see my coin, I can't claim it. Imagine implication of that situation to a common person. I should be able to go to a bank and claim my money because it's my money. And there are insurance and, of course, that system is also not perfect. So we're trying to figure out as to what's the balance between the two, if that makes sense. It's a long answer, but come on. You've got to have one more question. This is a big topic. Thank you again. Just joking, but.
Hey, I'm Alex from Gym Platform. You're talking a lot about business enterprise, but here in the room we are also a crowd made of mixed entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
And I was interested from your perspective, because you've been looking a lot on this, in terms of smaller ecosystems who are building up now, what's the type of roadmap from your perspective for new ideas coming to market via startups into the blockchain and crypto?
Yeah, no, so the reason why my session was here is to provide both sides. So I understand the startup community. I spend 40% of my time with your community. I have my personal interest in crypto because I cannot talk about it if I'm not practicing it. I have to practice it, I have to understand it. And so many of us have been working with startup community to build what we call investment rubric, which means the investment companies who invest with you, they need to have some model so they can say, okay, you're valid. So that's the model. The way I see is IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, we all have ecosystem and startup programs. So last year we launched a program where we give you access to our technology stack. We give you credits so you can come in. And we also announced something with Columbia University in New York, accelerator program. So if you have a great idea, we want you to develop that idea on our technology. I still think that most technical companies are thinking software in their mind. And some of us are trying to change that. Software is important, it's there, but the way enterprises and me and you consume software is changed from the open source world, and the consumption model of software is based on value, not simply on bits and bytes. So what we're trying to do is work with the startup community to bring them into our garage, into our incubation centers, to give you the startup things that you need. Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, we all do the same thing. To give you the technology, the mentoring, which is more important in my case, in some cases, and give you access, which is what Barclay has done with the accelerator labs, is they incubate you, and then they promote you to the ecosystem, because that's important too. I think that's where we see that no longer are, especially in crypto world, large companies are moving much slower than the innovation that it's happening on the open source, open systems. And we have to harness it. We cannot, as a big company, we cannot put startup so we have to sort of, work with you and bring you in. And that's the intent of, we have 4 programs in IBM that does exactly that. Why 4? Because we are a big company. I think we should be only 1. But most large companies have different programs, and we have 4 of them today, which focuses purely on startup and blockchain. If that makes sense. We'll have 46 seconds, and if you have no more questions, I do want to thank you for your time and your attention, and hopefully this 45 minutes was well worth the afternoon you spent with me, especially after lunch. It becomes a little hard to keep you all up. So thank you so much for your time.